Hello and welcome back to the channel. We have spoken just now, or in the last video, not just now. We have spoken about the residence, and that the residence of a taxpayer in one of the two states is the necessary condition for making use of the treaty. Now, that is going to be changed a bit in the future. Because, well, until now, in most cases, it was entirely sufficient to be resident in the treaty. Then you could claim the rights under the treaty, at least in most cases. So, Article 1 OECD Model Convention reflects that, or reflected that very simply. This treaty applies to all persons who are resident in one or even both of the two states signing this treaty. Now, that could sometimes lead to maneuvers where people did something which was called treaty shopping. Um, that's rather a technical term where you can't even imagine in the first moment what it means. Imagine the following situation. You want to invest in a country, let's say country B, and your own country, that's country A, does not have even a double taxation treaty with country B. So, shit. Or it might be that your country, country A, has a treaty with country B, but the conditions offered by that treaty are relatively bad. And so you think about other alternatives, and you find out that there is another country, AC, another country, which has a far better double taxation treaty with country B for your purposes. Now, well, officially you can't use that treaty because that treaty is for residents in country A, C, or B, but you reside in A. So that's bad luck. Now, when you have bad luck, try to change it. You might take refuge to setting up a company in country AC. This is now a taxpayer resident in country AC. And now you do not do your investment which you plan in person, but you just let the newly founded company in AC act in country B. So your activity will now be treated in B under the rules of the treaty with AC. You get that favorable treaty, which was originally not meant for you, but only for the citizens of the state AC. And finally, last but not least, sometime in the future, you will transfer the profits which you made from the company in AC in form of a dividend or in form of interest paid on a credit or license fees or whatever idea you ever have, which is the best way to transfer it to your home country, and there you end up with the money. So by that clever maneuver, you profited from a double taxation treaty which was intended for the citizens of another state. So state B gave you rights which, under the negotiations which they made with your home state A, could not have been claimed by you. Well, one thing must be seen as clear and evident. Nowadays, everybody can set up companies in every other country. There are nearly no limitations left on that under company law. So what that means is treaty shopping is, in principle, available everywhere. So, in principle, double taxation treaties by country B, which make a different treatment between AC and A as countries, make in the long run no sense anymore. Now, in all other areas of legal stuff, nearly all other areas of legal stuff, that has already been understood by the administrations. And nowadays, if you conclude a treaty with another country, for example, on trade issues, there's always some clause in it which is called a most favored nation clause. That means if we ever offer a better treatment to the citizen of any other country, you can automatically also claim these wider rights under that other treaty. Because everywhere else people have seen that it makes no difference to insist in different generosities to foreign citizens. Not in the tax area. Here people stick to their illusions from the 19th century. Here they insist in, why, there must be negotiations of bilateral basis. They must always be individual. Nobody can ever claim the profits or the advantages from a treaty which was not written for them, although 99% of all treaty consents is identical due to they just copy the OECD Model Convention. So, in the end, the states at the present stage of events do not very much like that treaty shopping is possible. They rather see it as somebody profits from the treaty AC to B, for which that treaty was not intended. That is directly an influence from hell and must be fought under all circumstances. So treaty shopping is labeled as bad, although it, in the end, is probably a very natural thing in an internationalized world. Well, this treaty shopping works always by establishing a company in another state, which is then owned by citizens or owners outside that state. And that makes such constructions suspicious. So the OECD, in their BEPS project, the project against base erosion and profit shifting and tax abuse and all that behavior which they do not like, the OECD wanted to restrict such possibilities and so to cut down the possibilities for international tax planning by this and similar constructions. So in the course of time, the states have, or some states have already developed and added to their tax treaty some clauses which were meant to prevent the success of such tax-saving constructions using double taxation treaty. And now in the BEPS project, the OECD thought we should make that the general standard. These clauses, which have been agreed upon, have in common that the rights granted by a treaty are denied for certain constructions or for certain persons. So, against treaty shopping, one would probably say we deny the rights under the treaty to every company which is established in country AC, but which is not owned by persons from country AC, or for which we cannot recognize a genuine economically convincing motive for its existence. So a company which is resident in country AC might, under the effect of such a clause, be denied the rights under the treaty. So it would be resident there, but it could not claim rights under the treaty because it doesn't have the right owners, but the wrong ones, people from outside country AC. So country B would not be bound to grant advantages or privileges or rights, however you call it, under the ACB treaty to that company set up in AC. That makes life a bit complicated. So you are resident there, but you can't invoke the rights under the treaty. That approach then makes it relatively senseless to establish a foreign company in order to profit from the treaty of a foreign company or foreign country, sorry. On the other hand, for legitimate companies which are set up for economic motive, it makes life more complicated because in order to be safe that they can claim rights under the treaty, they will have to prove that they are an exceptional case where the treaty rights should be granted in spite of such a clause. And so that makes these clauses usually relatively complicated. Now, the OECD said, okay, the MLI, the multilateral instrument which we proposed and which a huge number of states has already signed. That establishes now a duty for all signatory states of the MLI to take over into all their existing treaties clauses that, depending on the situation and on the choices made by states, they have certain selections which they can make. Clauses which deny the right granted under the treaty if the transaction in question has as one of its principal motives, its major or most important motives, the wish to profit from the treaty rules. So in every case where you optimize the taxpayer's behavior with respect to the tax consequences, just that you do some tax planning and say, if, for example, we invest in country B via the AC connection, then you get denied the rights granted under the treaty for that transaction. Or it might even be that you have to install additional clauses where whole persons get denied all rights under the treaty if these persons are not owned by the right other persons, so by unsuspicious owners, owners who are not suspected of running tax saving models, or by owners which are resident in country AC but not in country A or so. So in that case, one speaks of limitation on or of benefits clauses. And such a LOB clause then leads very often to the effect that the person in question cannot claim rights under the treaty, although it's a juridical body resident there. So that makes life a bit more complicated. Now, these clauses then are highly complicated in themselves because they always state a brutal principle. Nobody can invoke the rights under the treaty if, let's say, the principal purpose or one of the principal motives for activity is the tax. Well, tax is always on the back of the minds of people, so you could simply skip every application of the treaty. So there will be exceptions if you prove certain things or make certain things plausible, which then are listed, then that clause does not apply. Yeah. So very often the details can only be understood if you are already familiar with what tricks people can play and which things do not seem to be a trick but genuine economic behavior, what the fisc regards as normal and what as not. But the problem remains that at least the principal purpose test allows to deny the rights granted by a treaty to all persons involved, or that to all persons whose behavior justifies suspicion that tax was a motive. And limitation on benefits clauses usually are highly complicated and look if a juridical person has the right owners, and if it's the wrong owners, if these wrong owners can prove that they are nevertheless the right owners, that they are not suspicious of having done tax-saving maneuvers which the fiscal authorities would not tolerate or would not wish to tolerate. So these restrictions will make in the future the application of treaties far more complicated, as it can happen that although you are resident, all the consequences of a treaty can be denied to you. It is perhaps a good idea to deal with these clauses immediately after testing the residence. Depending on how complicated the clauses are and where the exceptions are, it can sometimes be necessary to later come back on the clauses and to say, okay, let's say principal purpose test or limitations on benefits test is according to the ownership of the person in question justified. So there is the risk of losing the treaty rules, and then it can happen that after you tested everything which would happen, you can prove, okay, if the treaty applies, nothing happens which would really justify to withdraw all the treaty rules from the application in this case. so that our taxpayer should have a right to an exception and then to test an exception. How exactly the best way is to deal with these additional clauses which modify fundamentally the application of treaties is nothing which one can already say at the moment. That will probably also strongly depend on the individual nature of such a treaty. At least for beginners, it is a clear thing that this is, under all circumstances, far too complicated. So you should only know about the existence of these things. You should keep in mind that these clauses exist. It might, at least in the future, spoil all the fun, change the results fundamentally of the basic testing result of a DTT, and that should be for you and me enough for the beginning. So thanks for listening carefully to this remark and hope to see you back soon.